My name's Becky Durham. I'm the pastor at First Presbyterian Church in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, and this is the Sunday sermon for the second Sunday in Advent, December 8th, 2024. We're using a series from a Sanctified art in this season at my church. And today we will read from Ruth chapter 1 and consider the theme, which is We Can't Go Alone. Listen now for the word of God from Ruth 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went to the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the other was Ruth. When they had lived there about 10 years in Moab, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she started to return to her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab, for she had heard that in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you, in the house of your husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. They said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it's been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me." Then they wept aloud again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. So Naomi said, "Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you, to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do thus to me and more as well, if even death parts me from you." When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Last year, the Surgeon General of the United States released a report that categorized loneliness as an epidemic. Now, we are most used to hearing this word to describe diseases caused by viruses like the flu or even now COVID-19. So that news caught my attention the first time I heard it. For something to be epidemic, there has to be a sudden increase in the number of cases of a disease or an issue above what is normally expected in a particular area. According to the Surgeon General's advisory, nearly half of all Americans report feeling lonely on a regular basis. And the thing about it is that loneliness is not only emotional. Loneliness becomes physical. Chronic loneliness increases the risk of illness or heart disease or anxiety or premature death. In a world that contains so many inventions to allow us to instantly connect to other people, even across many miles, think about phones and FaceTime and email and just the internet in general and various forms of social media. It's ironic that we seem to be in a state of even more profound isolation to the point that it's now epidemic. Yet we know that God created us for community and for connection from the very beginning. From Genesis 2:18, when the Lord declared it's not good for humankind to be alone, to the Gospels, where we read about Jesus calling together a community of disciples and sending them out in pairs for ministry and mission, we see that God's design for us is relationship and journeying together. And so here we have this story of Naomi and her daughters in law. We join these women in the obscurity of the time of the judges in the Bible. It's an Old Testament time between the arrival of the former Hebrew slaves to the promised land of Canaan and the establishment of a throne in Israel, a time before Kings David and Solomon, and before them, even Saul, more than 1,000 years before Jesus Christ's birth in Bethlehem. The scriptures focus us in on a family of refugees who have left Israel in a hard time, Elimelech and Naomi, along with their sons Mahlon and Chilion. They flee their home and they emigrate to Moab, which is southeast of Jerusalem, located on the other side of the Dead Sea and fertile plateaus known for rich land supportive of livestock. Moab, however, is also enemy territory. The nation of Israel and the nation of Moab are bitter enemies at this point. But Elimelech figures that Moab has the best potential for his family's life and health during the time of famine in Israel. While they are there, Elimelech dies. We don't know how, but now Naomi is a widow and a single mother living in a foreign land. Her sons come of age and they both get married to Moabite women, which would not have been ideal or acceptable back home. But when in Moab, the women who come into Naomi's family are Orpah and Ruth. In a storyline that is beginning to rival Job's, both of Naomi's sons die. She is a widow. She has lost both of her children, and she's living in God-forsaken Moab. But, and this is the only good news that she has found in this whole thing, she hears that back in Bethlehem, things are getting better. The famine is over. There's food. Sure, it means returning with shame. After all, they deserted Bethlehem to move to enemy territory, and now she's lost everything. But at least she can go home. I mean, probably not with these Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth should stay in their own country, of course. They can move back in with their mothers, maybe find new husbands. They're young with their whole lives ahead of them. Plus, Naomi knows she won't be good company living as desolated as she is. This is the only way, daughters. And so Orpah agrees and leaves Naomi and returns to her mother's house, but Ruth refuses. The book of Ruth is a story of connection and a loyal friend who is determined to keep her mother-in-law from journeying alone in her grief and sorrow. In this story, we see that sometimes in the darkest, most lonely places, God shows up in the presence of a friend or a companion. And after all, sometimes friendship comes from the places we least expect. Sometimes friendship comes from the places we least expect. The author of Ruth does not want us to forget something, and it is this: Ruth is a Moabite. This fact is emphasized throughout the reading today and throughout the whole book as well. It's very important as we read her story that we remember she does not belong in the family of God. Ruth is an outsider from a people considered to be the enemy of God's people. Yet here she is, loyal and true, a friend to the end for Naomi. Her speech is famous. Culturally, we often read these words during wedding ceremonies, this pledge made by Ruth to her mother-in-law. Verse 16, do not press me to leave you or turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do this and so to me and more as well, if even death parts me from you. And then verse 18 says that when Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. Ruth would not have been expected to stay by Naomi's side. As a widowed Moabite, she had every reason and allowance to return to her people. Orpah made the reasonable choice. Why leave home and family to go with someone who is no longer technically related to you into enemy territory? Yet Ruth chose the path of companionship and solidarity. Reading or hearing this story in the era that it was told would have garnered much the same reaction as the time when Jesus told the story of a good Samaritan. In the disciples' days, Samaritans were the enemy. They were backwards and unfaithful and unclean. There was nothing good about them. Yet Jesus tells the story of a man beaten badly and left for dead, passed by his own religious leaders and neighbors, only to ultimately be rescued by a Samaritan who went above and beyond what would have been expected to preserve this man's life. The story of Ruth the Moabite is such a story. It would have been unbelievable to think that the person who is loyal and true, devoted to the point of above and beyond, is a woman from Moab. Friendship came from an unexpected person and place in this story. This is true throughout the scriptures. The ones that seem to be outsiders turn out actually to be the ones on the inside, participating in what God is doing, acting in ways not expected that challenge prejudices and the lines drawn about who is in and who is out. Sometimes friendship comes from the place we least expect. Now let's look at what happens with Naomi in this story and consider the hard truth that sometimes solitude feels safer than the vulnerability of connection. Sometimes solitude feels safer than the vulnerability of connection. Naomi is heartbroken. How could she not be? Her heartbreak is more than sadness, it's a deep well of grief. In verse 8, she tells her daughters in law to go back to their mother's houses, blessing them to go, saying, may the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. Naomi says, not only have you had your own tragedy, but you've had to put up with me too. What causes someone to say that? Such deep, profound grief often makes us feel as though we must be a burden to others. The Lord has turned against me, she tells them in verse 13. It's better for me to be alone. And don't you know that when you have lost so much, it can be hard to receive anything positive that is left in your life? Isn't that just another thing to lose eventually? And don't you know that when sorrow weighs so heavy, it can be so hard to welcome or believe the kindness and the friendship and love offered by others? Each December, I lead my church in preparing and hosting a Blue Christmas service. It's a beautiful candlelight service. I've never had anyone express regret for having attended it, so I hope that you'll join us here at First Presbyterian Church, or maybe you'll find the service online in the middle of the month and participate that way. It's a service specifically planned for any and all who feel the weight of grief or loneliness or anxiety or illness, especially in the Christmas season. We'll gather during the darkest time of the year, remembering who and what has been lost. And then we will proclaim that a light shines in the darkness, and the darkness will not overcome it. This year, that will happen on Wednesday, December 18th at 6 p.m. at First Presbyterian Church in downtown Hopkinsville, Kentucky. As a pastor, I know that life does not always go like we want it to. I know that life is both beautiful and terrible all at the same time. I know that the most wonderful time of the year isn't always filled with all the most wonderful things. I know that loss forever changes how the season feels. And so we make a place for that. We make sure that it's a warm and hopeful space that allows us to acknowledge that hard reality. And we do it together because connection and community matter, especially in times of grief and pain. Sincerely, I invite you to plan to attend. I invite you to consider who in your life might be glad for an invitation to such a service, or who might need you to reach out and invite them to come with you so that they aren't alone that night and they know that their grief and their complicated feelings in this season are not a burden, at least not to you or not to your church. Naomi felt safer just being alone. It's a vulnerable thing to receive friendship sometimes. It's a vulnerable thing to let others into your pain. But when we do, God will be at work in that, not restoring what we have lost exactly, perhaps, but redeeming the pain and the sorrow and meeting us in hopeful and loving ways. Because sometimes God's grace and redemption are extended to us by other people. Sometimes God's grace and redemption are extended to us by other people. Something noted about the book of Ruth is the way that God is present in it. It's not a story of God audibly speaking and leading his people, like happens so often between Genesis and Deuteronomy. It's not a story of a conquering God like we find in Joshua and Judges. It's a story of how God works in relationships and how God redeems his people through loyalty and fidelity and love. And this chapter, after this chapter, the focus of the book, it's just 4 chapters long, the book of Ruth. It turns to life in Bethlehem and Naomi's quest to find a kinsman redeemer for her daughter in law, a man who would marry her son's widow to preserve the family line on Ruth's deceased husband's behalf. Boaz will be that redeemer. Much is made about that as the book of Ruth is studied. But it would be unfortunate to not note Ruth as a redeeming figure in the story as well. Her love and her loyalty are a vehicle for God's redemption in Naomi's life. Ruth's actions bring hope and provision and a renewed sense of belonging back to Naomi. Through Ruth, God extends grace to Naomi at the point when she most needed it. Thanks be to God for friends like Ruth who do that in our lives as well. But there's more at work here because we cannot neglect to mention that Ruth is one of the women in Jesus's own genealogy. There are 4 women mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew's first chapter account of the lineage of Jesus Christ. They are Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. Ruth fits into the genealogy because she is King David's great grandmother. Remember, Naomi and Ruth returned to Bethlehem. Bethlehem is the birthplace of King David, which is the reason that Joseph and Mary, as his ancestors, had to go to Bethlehem to register in Emperor Augustus's census. That's the home of the family line, all because Ruth and Naomi returned to Bethlehem here in Ruth 1. It should also be noted that the 4 women mentioned in this genealogy are women that most historians would not have included. First, because they are women and women do not belong in a genealogy at this time. It should have been the father's names, no matter what. But also, all of these women are women. All of these women are outsiders in some way. They're foreigners or they're women of ill repute. Yet all of them represent times and ways that God worked grace and redemption into the story of his people. And all of them are women who bring us through the millennia to the ultimate redemption that comes through the hope and salvation of Jesus Christ. So here's what I wonder today as we consider the epidemic levels of loneliness in our nation and in our community. First of all, I do wonder if these words about loneliness or grief have met you in a particular way this morning. Perhaps because you are struggling in this season of your life, feeling like you are alone or overwhelmed by how hard things are. And I want to be sure to say to you that you are not alone, that I would love for you to send me a message today or leave a comment reaching out or somehow contact me so that we can make plans to sit together and talk about that. For me, ministry most often looks like being present. I cannot fix your hard situations, but you don't have to go through them alone. For everyone else, I wonder how God is calling you to extend or receive grace in relationships today. We know that loneliness is devastating for our health, mental and physical. We can't go alone. How will we allow God to meet us through the friendship of others? Friendship may come from an unlikely person or place, but God is always making connections in unexpected places and ways. Community will require vulnerability and a willingness to let others into the messiness in our own lives, or for us to enter the messiness of grief or sorrow or anxiety to help another carry her or his load. In a world that struggles with loneliness, the story of Ruth and Naomi offers us hope. And so may we remember that we are not meant to go through life alone. May we find God's presence in unexpected places and through the people that God brings into our lives. And may we know that we are not alone. Amen. Thank you so much for joining me for the Sunday sermon today. I'm praying that the Lord would bless you and keep you this day and always. Amen.